The alien princess stood tall, her eyes gazing out over the vast expanse of the royal palace. Her empire was vast, stretching across planets and stars. Known for her wisdom and strength, she was a leader to be feared and respected. But today, her attention was not on the matters of her empire. It was on a human. The rumors had spread far and wide, reaching her ears with whispers of a human soldier who had gained a terrifying reputation. His name was spoken in hushed tones, and the stories that followed him were nothing short of legendary. He was said to be ruthless, an unstoppable force on the battlefield, defeating alien armies with little more than his bare hands and a cold heart. They called him the Ruthless Human. The princess, ever proud and unshaken, dismissed these stories as nothing more than exaggerations. Humans, in her mind, were primitive creatures. They lacked the grace and intelligence of her people. She had seen them on the battlefield, and their tactics were unsophisticated, their weapons crude. She did not believe for a moment that any human could be a true threat. Sitting on her throne, the princess raised an eyebrow as her advisor spoke. "Your Highness," he said, bowing respectfully, "there have been reports from our scouts. This human soldier has proven to be even more dangerous than we anticipated. He was the key to defeating an entire fleet of our allies, and now Earth is negotiating terms for peace." The princess sighed. Peace with a human? Ridiculous, she muttered under her breath. What could he possibly offer that would benefit us? A creature like him should never be considered an equal. Her advisor hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "The council believes it's time to meet him. They want you to extend an invitation for negotiations." Negotiations? The princess scoffed, standing from her throne with a regal air. "Fine, I will meet this so-called ruthless human. But I assure you, he will find no respect here." The advisor nodded, knowing better than to argue with his princess. "As you wish, Your Highness." And so, the preparations began. The princess, ever confident in her superiority, couldn't help but feel a small spark of curiosity. She had heard enough about this human to know he was nothing like the diplomats she was used to. No, this man was different, and she would soon learn just how different. As the time for the meeting grew closer, the princess tried not to let the rumors sway her. A ruthless human would be nothing but a nuisance. She was certain of it. After all, how could someone from such an insignificant planet ever match her power? Yet, a nagging thought in the back of her mind made her wonder. Could this human truly live up to his fearsome reputation? The answer would soon be clear, and the princess prepared herself for an encounter that would change everything she thought she knew about humans. The princess arrived on Earth with her royal entourage, the atmosphere inside the ship tense with anticipation. Her heart was calm, her mind focused. This was no ordinary diplomatic mission. This human, with his brutal reputation, was said to be the one who had outsmarted the most powerful alien fleets. But she was not intimidated. No, she was determined to meet him and prove once and for all that her people were far superior to these primitive creatures. As the ship landed, the princess stepped out, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Earth was nothing like the luxurious world she was used to. The air was thick with humidity, the ground muddy, and the structures were simple compared to the grand palaces she ruled over. It was all so earthly. Her entourage followed her as they made their way to the designated meeting place, a small military base surrounded by vast green fields. The human soldier they were there to meet, the one they called Ruthless, was waiting for them. When they arrived, the princess immediately spotted him. Standing just a few feet away, there he was, a man of average height, his features not striking, but strong. His clothes were simple, not regal or grand like hers, but worn, as if he had seen countless battles. His face was calm, with sharp, focused eyes that seemed to read everything around him. This was the famous human who had taken down entire armies. The princess couldn't hide her surprise. The man didn't seem anything like the ruthless warrior she had been led to believe. He did not have the fearsome aura that her advisors had described. Nor did he seem anything more than an ordinary soldier. His posture was relaxed, yet there was a certain confidence about him, as though he had faced death and came out unscathed. "Princess," he said, his voice steady and respectful as he bowed slightly, "I am honored by your visit." The princess, though taken aback, kept her face neutral. "You are the one they call ruthless," she remarked, her tone cold. "I have expected much more. Intimidation." The human soldier chuckled softly, his gaze never wavering. "Intimidation is not my style, Your Highness," he said. "But I understand why people might think that of me." His calmness irked the princess. She had expected someone more aggressive, someone who would at least try to show some kind of power. Instead, this man, this soldier, seemed almost unimpressed, as though he had nothing to prove. "You were the one who single-handedly defeated an entire fleet of my allies," she said, her voice sharper now. "Tell me, how did you manage such a feat?" The human paused, his expression thoughtful. "Strategy, Your Highness. Every battle is a chessboard. You have to see the moves before they happen." The princess frowned. Strategy. Was that all? She had expected stories of bloodshed, of violent battles where this man crushed his enemies with sheer force. But instead, he spoke of planning, of understanding his opponent's every move. "You think too highly of yourself, human," she said, her tone dismissive. "You are just one soldier, no different from the others." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of her mind. There was something more to this man than she had first thought. He wasn't the ruthless monster she had been led to believe. Instead, he seemed like someone who had mastered the art of war in ways she had never considered. And for the first time, the princess found herself wondering, was she truly superior to him? The princess arrived on Earth with her royal entourage, the atmosphere inside the ship tense with anticipation. Her heart was calm, her mind focused. This was no ordinary diplomatic mission. This human, with his brutal reputation, was said to be the one who had outsmarted the most powerful alien fleets. But she was not intimidated. No, she was determined to meet him and prove once and for all that her people were far superior to these primitive creatures. As the ship landed, the princess stepped out, her dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Earth was nothing like the luxurious world she was used to. The air was thick with humidity, the ground muddy, and the structures were simple compared to the grand palaces she ruled over. It was all so earthly. Her entourage followed her as they made their way to the designated meeting place, a small military base surrounded by vast green fields. The human soldier they were there to meet, the one they called Ruthless, was waiting for them. When they arrived, the princess immediately spotted him. Standing just a few feet away, there he was, a man of average height, his features not striking, but strong. His clothes were simple, not regal or grand like hers, but worn, as if he had seen countless battles. His face was calm, with sharp, focused eyes that seemed to read everything around him. This was the famous human who had taken down entire armies. The princess couldn't hide her surprise. The man didn't seem anything like the ruthless warrior she had been led to believe. He did not have the fearsome aura that her advisors had described, nor did he seem anything more than an ordinary soldier. His posture was relaxed, yet there was a certain confidence about him, as though he had faced death and came out unscathed. "Princess," he said, his voice steady and respectful as he bowed slightly, "I am honored by your visit." The princess, though taken aback, kept her face neutral. "You are the one they call Ruthless," she remarked, her tone cold. "I have expected much more. Intimidation." The human soldier chuckled softly, his gaze never wavering. "Intimidation is not my style, Your Highness," he said, "but I understand why people might think that of me." His calmness irked the princess. She had expected someone more aggressive, someone who would at least try to show some kind of power. Instead, this man, this soldier, seemed almost unimpressed, as though he had nothing to prove. You were the one who single-handedly defeated an entire fleet of my allies, she said, her voice sharper now. Tell me, how did you manage such a feat? The human paused, his expression thoughtful. Strategy, Your Highness. Every battle is a chessboard. You have to see the moves before they happen. The princess frowned. Strategy. Was that all? She had expected stories of bloodshed, of violent battles where this man crushed his enemies with sheer force. But instead, he spoke of planning, of understanding his opponent's every move. You think too highly of yourself, human, she said, her tone dismissive. You are just one soldier, no different from the others. But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the nagging thought at the back of her mind. There was something more to this man than she had first thought. He wasn't the ruthless monster she had been led to believe. Instead, he seemed like someone who had mastered the art of war in ways she had never considered. And for the first time, the princess found herself wondering, was she truly superior to him? The princess sat in the makeshift conference room, surrounded by her royal guards, a few high-ranking officers from the human side, and the human soldier himself. The air was thick with tension. The time for formal negotiations had arrived, but the princess couldn't shake her growing unease. The human, as she had begun to understand, was not what she had expected. And the more she interacted with him, the more questions arose in her mind. Her gaze flicked to the human, who was seated across from her, looking calm as ever. His hands were folded neatly on the table, and his eyes locked onto hers with an unwavering focus. The princess could feel the weight of his gaze, but she tried not to let it bother her. After all, she was the ruler here, the one with the power. He was just a soldier, a tool to be used. Let us get straight to the point, the princess said, her voice firm. You come from a primitive world, yet somehow you have managed to gain the respect of others. Tell me why I should believe that your people have anything worth offering to my empire. The human soldier didn't flinch at her cold words. He leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but unshaken. Because we don't conquer with force or fear. We've learned that true strength lies in cooperation, in finding common ground. What your empire has built can only last if you learn to work with others, not crush them. The princess narrowed her eyes, but she couldn't deny the calm conviction in his voice. Still, her pride wouldn't allow her to give in to his reasoning. Cooperation. You think we need cooperation. My empire is built on strength. We do not need anyone else. The human didn't raise his voice, didn't argue forcefully. Instead, he simply nodded, his face thoughtful. It's a valid point, he said, but strength alone can only take you so far. Eventually, you'll find that other forces will rise against you, and when that happens, your empire might not be strong enough to stand on its own. The princess felt a flicker of frustration. This was not the conversation she had expected. She had assumed that this human, with his ruthless reputation, would try to force her into submission, to intimidate her into making concessions. But instead, he was speaking as if they were equals, calmly challenging everything she believed to be true. I don't need to be lectured by a human soldier, she snapped, her voice rising. I've ruled for centuries. I know how to lead. But even as she said it, the words felt hollow. She had never had to defend her rule against someone like him before. All her life, she had been surrounded by advisors and allies who feared her power, who bowed to her authority without question. This human didn't fear her, and worse, he was making sense. For the first time in her life, the princess felt a twinge of doubt. Could it be that this human was right? Could she have built her empire on the wrong foundation? Could her power, her strength, be nothing more than a mask to hide her own insecurities? Her thoughts were interrupted when the human spoke again, his voice calm, but with a note of understanding. I'm not here to challenge your rule, Your Highness. I'm here to offer a different way. If you want your empire to last, to truly thrive, you'll have to think beyond what you know. Fear and strength can only carry you so far. The princess fell silent. She had no response. She wasn't used to this kind of challenge. She was used to winning, to bending others to her will. But this soldier, was not like the others. And as much as she hated to admit it, she realized he might be right. The princess paced back and forth in her quarters, deep in thought. The conversation earlier had left her unsettled. She had come to Earth with one purpose: to dismiss the rumors about the ruthless human and prove her superiority. But instead, the human soldier had made her question everything she thought she knew about power, leadership, and strength. Her pride was bruised. No one had ever dared to challenge her beliefs so directly. She had spent centuries ruling her empire with strength and fear, but now she was beginning to wonder if it was enough. Could there be another way? The princess knew that she couldn't let this doubt show. She was a ruler, and rulers had to appear strong. To regain her sense of control, she decided to challenge the human soldier in a way that she was certain would put him in his place. She would test his intellect. The next day, she arranged a private meeting with the human soldier. The room was set with a large table in the center, covered in maps of both their worlds and strategic layouts. The princess stood at one end, her posture regal and unyielding, while the human stood at the opposite end, calm as always. "I believe," the princess began, her voice steady, "that a true test of strength is not just in battle, but in strategy. I propose we engage in a game of tactics, a challenge where both our minds will be tested. If you win, I will listen to your arguments. If I win, you will cease to question my leadership." The human looked at her, his face thoughtful. "A game of strategy, Your Highness?" he asked. "And what kind of game do you have in mind?" The princess smiled slightly, knowing that this would be her chance to outsmart him. "We will each command armies and attempt to outmaneuver the other. A battle of wits, not force. I will use my empire's strengths, and you will use whatever resources you have. Let's see if your cooperation can match the might of my strategy." The human soldier nodded. "I accept your challenge. But I warn you, I don't take this lightly." The game began. The two of them carefully studied the maps laid before them, each making their moves with precision. The princess moved quickly, her mind working like a well-oiled machine, using her vast knowledge of military strategy and her empire's resources to outmaneuver the human. She believed she was in control, confident in her ability to outthink him at every turn. But as the game went on, she began to notice something. The human soldier wasn't just reacting to her moves. He was anticipating them. He had a way of thinking several steps ahead, turning her own tactics against her. Each time she thought she had him cornered, he found a way to break free. It wasn't long before the princess realized she was losing. The human had outsmarted her at every turn, his strategy more intricate and clever than anything she had expected. In the end, the human soldier stood victorious. The princess's pride burned, but she could not deny the truth. He had beaten her, not with brute force, but with the very thing she had underestimated: his mind. "You've won, human," the princess said, her voice low but respectful. "Your strategy was flawless. I will listen to your arguments, but only because you have proven that I can learn something from you." The human smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. "I didn't win because I'm better than you, Your Highness. I won because I was willing to listen, to learn, and to think beyond what I already knew." For the first time since meeting him, the princess felt a sense of true respect for the human soldier. She realized that maybe, just maybe, his way was the right way. And as much as it stung her pride, she was willing to learn from him. The princess stood at the edge of the battlefield, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light over the rolling hills and scattered trees. It was peaceful here, in stark contrast to the tension that lay ahead. The human soldier, who had now become an unexpected ally, stood next to her, his gaze focused and sharp. Together, they had agreed to join forces against a growing threat from a rogue faction that had been wreaking havoc across the galaxy. The princess had never worked with anyone like him before, and though she had accepted his assistance, she couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that came with it. They had been on this mission for hours, scouting the enemy's position, trying to find the best approach. The princess had led many successful campaigns in the past, but this time felt different. For the first time, she was not the one in complete control. The human soldier had proven himself capable, and now his insights were shaping their strategy. She hated how it made her feel vulnerable. "The enemy's defenses are stronger than we thought," the human said, breaking her thoughts. "If we charge in recklessly, we'll be outnumbered and outgunned. We need a diversion." The princess glanced at him, her eyes narrowed. "A diversion? And you think we have time for that?" He nodded, undeterred. "Yes, we can use the terrain to our advantage. I'll draw their attention, while you and your forces flank them from behind. It'll be risky, but it's the best shot we have." The princess felt a flicker of doubt. She had never relied on anyone's plan but her own, and the thought of putting her trust in this human's idea was unsettling. Still, she knew he had been right before. She couldn't afford to let her pride stand in the way of a victory. "Very well," she said, her voice steady. "We'll proceed with your plan. But if anything goes wrong, it will be your responsibility." The human nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Understood, Your Highness." They split up to execute the plan, and the princess found herself watching from a distance as the human soldier led a small team toward the enemy's main camp. He moved with confidence, his steps quick but calculated. The princess admired how he handled himself, without fear, without hesitation. This was the soldier she had expected to meet when she first arrived on Earth, not the thoughtful strategist she had come to know. Her forces, positioned behind a ridge, were ready to launch the attack once the diversion was in place. She watched intently, her fingers tightening around her weapon as she waited for the signal. Suddenly, the air around her seemed to change. The human had been spotted. The enemy forces moved toward him, just as planned, but something unexpected happened. Instead of retreating, the human charged forward, taking the fight straight to the enemy. The princess's heart skipped a beat. Was he crazy? Did he not understand the risks? But before she could act, the enemy began to shift, completely unaware of the princess's forces now closing in from behind. The diversion had worked. The human's reckless bravery had distracted them long enough for the princess's army to strike. The battle was swift, with the princess's forces overwhelming the disoriented enemy. Within moments, the rogue faction's defenses collapsed, and victory was theirs. As the dust settled, the princess approached the human, who stood, panting and bloodied, but with a satisfied smile on his face. "You did it," she said, her voice softer than usual. The human wiped his brow and nodded. "We did it, but your forces executed the plan perfectly." This was a team effort. For the first time, the princess didn't feel the need to argue. She knew he was right. They had won because they had worked together, not because of one person's strength. The princess extended her hand, her expression serious but respectful. "Thank you. I didn't expect you to succeed, but you did. You've earned my respect." The human shook her hand, his smile widening. "It's not about success or failure, Your Highness. It's about understanding when to trust others and when to let go of your own pride." For the first time since meeting him, the princess truly understood. She had let her pride cloud her judgment for too long. And in this moment, she realized that working with the human soldier had opened her eyes to a new way of thinking, a way that did not rely on fear or strength alone, but on trust, cooperation, and the courage to face the unknown together. The days after the battle felt different. The princess couldn't quite place why, but everything had shifted. She had fought alongside the human soldier, and together they had achieved something remarkable. The enemy had been defeated, their plans foiled. And yet, as the dust settled and the war came to a close, the princess found herself thinking more and more about the human who had once seemed so beneath her. In the days that followed, they worked together to clean up the remnants of the battle. The princess had seen soldiers come and go, their faces filled with pride or defeat, but there was something about this human that stood out. He was unlike anyone she had ever met. He didn't boast about the victory. He didn't demand praise. Instead, he simply got to work, helping the injured, making sure the wounded were cared for, and organizing the troops for the next phase of their journey. There was no ego in his actions, no arrogance. He simply did what needed to be done, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. The princess watched him in silence, her gaze following him as he moved about the camp. She couldn't help but notice how different he was from the others. The soldiers around her often sought her attention, eager for her approval, but this human never seemed to ask for anything in return. He didn't even seem interested in recognition. "You're quiet today, Your Highness," the human said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. He had approached her from behind, standing beside her as they both surveyed the camp. "I thought you'd be celebrating." The princess looked at him, surprised. She hadn't realized how much time had passed as she'd been lost in her own thoughts. "Celebrating," she repeated. "I'm not sure what there is to celebrate." The human soldier turned to her, his face unreadable. "We won. That's reason enough." She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "We did. But it's not just that. It's something else, something I can't quite explain." The human raised an eyebrow, sensing the change in her tone. "Is it because of the way I fought, Your Highness?" The princess frowned. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her had been surprised by how he had led their forces, how he had risked everything without hesitation. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who led with something more than strength. He led with heart. "No," she said, her voice softening. "It's not just that. It's how you act, how you lead. You don't need to prove anything, and yet you do so much. You care for your people, even when they don't see it. You make them believe in something bigger than just victory. And I think I've spent my whole life leading through fear, and I don't know if that's enough anymore." The human soldier was quiet for a moment, considering her words. He had always known that the princess was powerful, that she ruled with strength. But he hadn't expected her to be so vulnerable, so willing to admit her doubts. He had spent so many years seeing leaders who refused to show weakness, and yet here she was, standing before him, admitting her own uncertainty. "You're not the only one," he said quietly. "We all have our doubts, but it's how we face them that matters. You've led with strength, but you've also led with wisdom. That's why you're where you are." The princess looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his gaze, the way he truly believed in what he was saying. There was no hint of manipulation, no ulterior motive. He was simply being honest. For the first time, the princess realized something. This human, this soldier she had once dismissed, had shown her a different way of leading. It wasn't about proving power or forcing people into submission. It was about leading with respect, with understanding, and with the ability to adapt. A small part of her wondered what might have happened if she had met him sooner, but she pushed that thought away. The past was the past. What mattered now was the future, and she realized that the human soldier was someone she wanted to face that future with. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady but full of gratitude. "You've taught me more than you know." The human soldier smiled, his eyes warm. "It's my honor, Your Highness." And in that moment, the princess knew. They were no longer just allies. They were something more. And no matter where their paths took them, they would face whatever came next together. The sun had long set, casting a cool darkness over the camp. The princess sat by the fire, her thoughts swirling in a storm of conflicting emotions. The events of the past few days had changed her more than she cared to admit. She had come to Earth expecting to find a warrior to conquer and dismiss, but instead, she had found a human who had become a force of change in her life. She couldn't stop thinking about the human soldier. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. While her empire was built on strength and power, he led with a quiet strength, one that wasn't based on fear or intimidation, but on understanding, trust, and respect. It was a kind of leadership that the princess had never experienced before, and it was beginning to unsettle her. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence around her. She stared into the flames, watching the flickering light dance, as if trying to find answers within the warmth. The questions had been piling up in her mind since their victory. Could her empire truly survive with the methods she had relied on for so long? Was there more to leadership than what she had been taught? And if so, could she change? Your Highness, a voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to find the human soldier standing a few feet away, his silhouette framed by the firelight. He had approached quietly, as he always did, never demanding attention, always patient. "You've been quiet tonight," he said softly. "Is everything all right?" The princess sighed, her eyes weary. "I'm not sure," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "So much has changed, and I don't know how to process it all. I've spent my life ruling with strength, commanding with power, but now I feel like I don't know what I'm doing." The human stepped closer, his expression serious yet kind. "You're not the first leader to feel that way. The hardest part is realizing that leadership isn't just about strength. It's about knowing when to listen, when to learn, and when to let go of old habits." The princess stared at him, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. She had always believed that strength and control were the only ways to lead, but now she wasn't so sure. This human soldier had shown her a different path, one that required humility, patience, and the willingness to evolve. She had spent her entire life surrounded by advisors and generals who feared her, but the human soldier didn't fear her. He respected her, but more than that, he saw her for who she truly was, a leader, yes, but also a person with flaws and doubts, and that realization struck her harder than any battle ever could. "Do you think I can change?" the princess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The human smiled, though it was a smile full of understanding. "I don't think you need to change who you are. I think you just need to realize that there's more than one way to be strong, and that strength doesn't always come from control." The princess felt a lump form in her throat. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to feel vulnerable, to admit that she was unsure. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she confessed, her voice faltering. "But I want to try." The human nodded. "That's all anyone can do. Try." As the fire crackled between them, the princess realized something. She had spent so much of her life in search of power, but what she truly needed was a different kind of strength. The strength to be open to change, to admit her mistakes, and to lead with the understanding that sometimes true leadership meant following a new path. And in that moment, she knew her journey had only just begun. She wasn't the same princess who had arrived on Earth. She was stronger in ways she hadn't even imagined, and the human soldier standing before her had helped her see that. Together, they would face whatever came next, not as ruler and subject, but as allies who had learned from one another. The princess smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for showing me what true strength really is." The human smiled back, his eyes warm with understanding. "It's my honor, Your Highness. It's my honor." The following days brought a new sense of calm to the princess. She no longer felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on her shoulders. The human soldier had taught her something she never thought possible. There was strength in letting go, strength in learning from others, and strength in trusting those around her. For the first time, she could see that leadership didn't always have to come from fear or control. The two of them spent more time together, not as ruler and soldier, but as allies. The princess had begun to listen more to the human's ideas, and she found herself considering things from a new perspective. He was a soldier, yes, but he was also a diplomat, a strategist, and most importantly, a person who cared deeply for the people he led. That was something she had always overlooked in her quest for power. One morning, as they prepared to leave the camp for a new mission, the princess walked over to the human, who was already organizing supplies for the journey. "You've been an invaluable ally," she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of something softer beneath the surface. "I never thought I'd say this, but I have learned more from you than I ever could have imagined." The human soldier glanced up from his work, his face filled with quiet gratitude. "I'm just doing my part, Your Highness. You've taught me a lot, too. Your courage to question your own methods, to admit when something isn't working. That's true strength." The princess felt a warmth in her chest at his words, though she didn't say anything more. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. They had both changed in ways they never could have predicted when they first met. As they set out on their new mission, the princess couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to control every outcome. She had learned to trust others, and more importantly, she had learned to trust herself in a way she never had before. They faced many challenges in the days that followed, but with each one, the princess felt more confident in her ability to lead. She no longer relied on fear to command respect. Instead, she led with the understanding that her people, whether human or alien, deserved not just her strength, but her respect and trust. The human soldier had become more than just an ally. He had become her confidant, her equal, and her friend. They fought side by side, each one supporting the other, each one learning from the other. The princess had learned to see the value in cooperation and compassion, and the human had learned that even those in power had vulnerabilities. One night, as they stood on the edge of a cliff, overlooking the stars, the princess spoke again. "I used to think that power came from being untouchable, from ruling with an iron fist. But now, I see that power is something much more. It's about being able to rely on others, to work together. And I never thought I would say this, but I'm grateful for you, human." The human soldier smiled, his gaze soft but full of understanding. "And I'm grateful for you, princess. You've shown me that leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about being willing to learn and grow, no matter where you come from." The princess smiled, her heart lighter than it had ever been. The journey ahead was still long, but now she knew she wasn't walking it alone. They had each other, and that, she realized, was the greatest strength of all. The princess stood on the balcony of her ship, gazing out into the vastness of space. The stars shimmered like distant promises, and the feeling of uncertainty that had once filled her heart had slowly started to fade. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of battles, revelations, and change, but the princess felt stronger than ever. Not because of her power or her ability to command armies, but because of the new path she had chosen. Beside her stood the human soldier, as steady and calm as ever. They had spent countless hours together, facing challenges, sharing ideas, and learning from one another. He had become her closest ally, and more importantly, her equal. She couldn't remember the last time she felt this connected to anyone. "You've been quiet lately, Your Highness," the human soldier said, his voice breaking the silence. The princess turned her gaze toward him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I've been thinking," she replied softly, "about everything we've been through, how much I've changed, and how much we've both learned from each other." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy, changing the way you've always done things, but you've done it. You've seen things from a new perspective." The princess glanced back at the stars, her thoughts distant. "I used to believe that strength was about control, that I had to be untouchable, feared by everyone around me. But I've learned that true strength comes from being open to others, open to new ideas, and even open to change." The human soldier smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "I'm glad you've realized that. You're a leader, princess, not because of your power or your title, but because of your ability to adapt, to understand, and to make decisions for the greater good." The princess's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and warmth. She had never expected to find such a bond with anyone, least of all a human. Yet here she was, standing next to him, no longer just a ruler and a soldier, but partners in a new alliance, one built on trust, respect, and understanding. "What happens now?" the princess asked, her voice filled with a quiet curiosity. "Where do we go from here?" The human soldier glanced up at the stars, his gaze steady. "Wherever the journey takes us, together." Together. The word echoed in the princess's mind. She had never considered that before. She had always ruled alone, surrounded by advisors and soldiers, but always at the top, alone in her decisions. Now, with the human by her side, she realized how much strength there was in partnership. They didn't have to walk separate paths. They could share the burden, share the victories, and face whatever came next as equals. The ship's engines hummed softly in the background, signaling that it was time to depart. The princess took one last look at the stars, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had someone by her side, someone she trusted, someone who had shown her that there was more to leadership than strength alone. As the ship sailed into the depths of space, the princess looked at the human soldier once more. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad you came into my life." The human soldier met her gaze, his expression warm. "And I'm glad you let me in, princess." And so, together, they began a new chapter of their journey, not as enemies, not as ruler and subject, but as partners who had learned the true meaning of strength together.